Midnight Motorist, one of the most cryptic parts of Five Nights at Freddy's, which is wild because we have minigames in this franchise that look like this, and we can look at it as a community and almost unanimously be like, oh yeah, that's William Afton, that's Charlotte Emily, and this is the creation of the puppet. But then we get this 16, maybe 32-bit minigame that gives us named locations, full dialogue, and even a locational layout, but none of us can agree on the details. Well, today I thought I'd throw my hat into the ring, especially since a few of my fellow creators have already done so recently, like ID's Fantasy. And while I have discussed Midnight Motorist before, I didn't realize I've never made a dedicated video on it. So slices, put on your aprons, and let's bake ourselves a theory. First, let's gather our ingredients. And my cat turned into a plushie. The Rytos YouTube's plushie, that is an official YouTube's produced plushie. The link is in the description and in the card right here. It's only available for one more week. Please get it. It supports the channel and it's really cute. Look at him. Don't you love him? I know you do. Take him home. Look, it even has cat fur. Just kidding. This one has cat fur because I have cats. It does not come with cat fur. Everything I own just has cat fur on it because I have 3 cats. So I think the thing that's really going to see us through to the end of this meaning of the minigame is context. So we need to know everything in and around this minigame because FNAF 6 is packed with lore. It's probably the most lore-heavy game in the entire franchise, which is fitting since it was meant to be the final game of the franchise, just like FNAF 4, and FNAF 3, and Ultimate Custom Night. And because of that though, we learn a lot about the grander timeline through the cutscenes, minigames, and endings of this game. As far as the endings go, there's really 2 that are lore impactful: the Insanity ending and the Completion ending. The Insanity ending gives us a lot of information on Henry, the man behind the creation of the FNAF 6 Pizzeria. He tells us in a cryptic way that the souls of the victims of William are trapped within the creations of Henry, aka the early animatronics of the franchise. He also tells us that William lured them back with a familiar trick and took everything they had again. Using the cutscene's visuals, we can assume he's implying follow me. Henry then goes on to say that he has to heal the wound that was first inflicted on him, but that he let fester into all of this, and the monologue ends with him resolving to do FNAF 6. Essentially, this cutscene deals with the beginning of the timeline, hence that whole first bit there. The other ending with lore actually bookends the timeline because the completion ending deals with the end of the timeline. Henry monologues again, but this time he's talking about the FNAF 6 trap, that it worked and it lured Scrap Baby, William Afton, Molten Freddy, and the Marionette all to this location. He laments over his daughter and what she's gone through, and says that finally everything can burn to the ground, trying to end it all essentially. All in all, the lore-based endings of this game deal with either end of the timeline. So what about the lore-based minigames? There are 3 in question, and I'll deal with the most straightforward one first: Security Puppet. In this minigame, we see Charlotte Emily being locked outside by some bullies, and the security puppet being blocked into his box, not being able to help. The puppet is eventually able to get there, but because of the rain, he just collapses onto her, because when he finds her, she's already dead in an alleyway. Thanks to the Henry monologue, we actually get confirmation that this is Charlotte Emily, and that this is depicting another angle of the Give Cake to the Children cutscene, aka William Afton driving up to a Fazbear restaurant, killing Charlotte, and driving away. One more thing to note are the tire tracks at the end of this cutscene, which, if Give Cake to the Children is to be believed, makes a lot of sense. The next minigame of note is Fruity Maze. At first, it's just a enemyless Pac-Man where you're collecting fruit and power-ups, but if you beat it several times in a row, it starts turning more and more into depictions of this dead dog, and the girl we see in the reflection gets more and more sad until eventually Spring Bonnie's behind her. After the last time you play it, he says, "He is not really dead, he is over here, follow me," in yellow and blue text. This does seem fairly cryptic, but if you take into account the names we get at the end of FNAF 6, the death lines from Chica in Ultimate Custom Night where she mentions she was the first, the actions of Toy Chica in the high school years where she mentions that she'll trick a child by telling them their dog is dead, and the art that we see in the Silver Eyes novels, we can make a fairly solid assumption, and most people have, that this is Susie, aka the first victim of the missing child incident that William killed and stuffed into Chica. And finally, we have the minigame of the hour, Midnight Motorist. The game itself is this high-paced racing game where you're trying to avoid cars and get to as far as you can and eventually hit a finish line. But right at the end, there's an opening on the bottom, and if you go in there, you get access to the actually lore-relevant secret minigame, where we're going down this winding forest road in the rain. We can stop by and see a mound in the woods. We can try to go into a building named Junior's, but this man tells us not to go in there. And finally, we can go to this house, where we exit our purple car and find that we're playing as this yellow guy. He goes inside. The person watching TV on the couch tells us to leave him alone. he's had a rough day. We don't listen, we go to that door, we try to get in, we yell to get in, but it's locked. So, being a totally normal dude, he decides to go outside in the rain and try to go in through the window. When we get there, we notice the window's been broken. Whoever was in there ran away. There's this three-toed animatronic footprints, and the yellow guy resolves he's ran off to that place again. He'll be sorry when he gets back. The cutscene ends. Yeah, you can see why this is up for a lot of debate. Before we get into what I think the correct theory is, let's go into some other perfectly valid theories that I hear a lot and explain why I personally don't believe them. One of the more common theories I've actually seen passed around about this cutscene is that this is just depicting the shaky family life of one of the missing child incident kids. In other words, if this was the immediate aftermath of one of the missing child incident victims, then this would be later that night. I just realized I forgot to mention it. But in the code for Midnight Motorist, this secret minigame is referred to as later that night. But like I said, this is a really plausible theory. After all, nothing about this family really tracks well with what we know about the Aftons. The house doesn't super line up, we don't really know who these people are, and I mean, to be fair, that's not purple. Furthermore, if Junior's is a bar, then we would be establishing that whoever this runaway child is, he doesn't have a happy home life, and he'd be more willing to trust Spring Bonnie, which would make him an easier victim for William Afton. Like, we know this kid is unsafe. His dad comes home drunk and tries to break down his door and is willing to go in through his window to, I guess, scream at him for no reason. So, like, clearly not a good guy. And if this is the case, then the footprints outside would be that child running off, and William, presumably in one of the early felt suits like we see in Help Wanted, luring that kid out of their bedroom. And as another piece of evidence for it, the methods of Toy Chica. Like I mentioned, one of her methods is referenced in Fruity Maze, aka telling a kid that their dead dog isn't actually dead and they can follow them. It's interesting to note then that in episode 5, she says this.
I told him to come over later. That should be enough. And if he doesn't show up, I'll just go to his house. And if he doesn't open the door, I'll just find a window.
That lines up pretty good with what we see here. All of this does seem pretty solid, and again, I don't fault anyone, nor is anybody wrong for believing this, but to me, it just doesn't feel right. One of the larger reasons being that we have absolutely no evidence of William ever going to somebody's house to kidnap them. All of the evidence-backed things that we have for William doing murders are at or around Fazbear locations. Now, I don't have any hard evidence that fully disproves this theory. That's not what the point of this video is. But what I do have, in my opinion, is stronger evidence that proves something else. That being that this man is William Afton. And if that's true, then this theory can't work. So I disagree with this theory. But again, to be super clear, I'm not disproving this theory. It's totally possible. I'm just arguing for my theory. With a lot of theories on the more vague parts of this franchise, it really comes down to where you're willing to make an assumption, because no matter what, you're going to have to. So why is William Afton suddenly yellow and not purple guy? Well, I have two major reasons for it. One of them is very evidence-backed and it's compelling and it's narratively satisfying, and the other one is kind of stupid, but it's equally likely. We'll cover the first one first so I don't lose you. Throughout the series, William is depicted as actually both purple and yellow depending on the context. The question is instead, when are these colors applied and why? Whenever we've seen William primarily depicted as purple, he's showing his true evil side. He's vindictive, he's violent, and he's enjoying it the whole time. This is the color he's in during the missing child incident. This is the color he's in during the dead child incident. This is the color he's in when he kills Charlotte Emily. He's even this color when he's taking apart the old haunted animatronics against their will. Purple is William Afton, but William Afton isn't always purple, just as he's not always William Afton. On occasion, he's Spring Bonnie, innocent and comforting, and most children trust him implicitly. During that time, he's yellow. The movie backs this up actually. When William isn't Afton, he's Steve Raglan, and Steve Raglan wears a yellow shirt hiding a deeper purple inside. William Afton, deep down, might truly be a purple-colored character, but when he faces the rest of the world, he displays himself as yellow, the opposite side of the color wheel. That's why, during Give Cake to the Children when no one else is around, William Afton is purple and kills Charlotte. But even in that same night, when he goes in front of other people at the bar and at his house, he's yellow. That's why this is William Afton. And now I hear you. I mentioned earlier that there was a much less compelling but equally possible reason why he's yellow here. That's just honestly game design. Let me show you what the minigame would look like if he was purple. Yeah, having a purple sprite this small on a pixelated rainy night map is almost impossible to see. The yellow really helps and makes it much more playable. Alright, so we've established that I think it's incredibly likely that this man is William Afton. But if that's the case, what about the rest of the cutscene? Well, there is another entirely plausible and incredibly likely theory that I also don't agree with. That being that this couch person is Michael Afton and the crying child is the runaway. This theory was actually recently argued for by ID's Fantasy, the person I mentioned earlier, and she makes a really compelling case for it. She raises points that if William's yellow text is relevant, why wouldn't the gray text of the couch person be relevant as well? And Michael Afton is known to sit on the couch and watch TV and speaks in gray text. Furthermore, being crying child's brother, if his father came home drunk and angry, he would probably try to, in whatever limited way he can, defend the crying child. Be like, hey, lay off him. And as far as the crying child goes, in this theory, he would have been led away by one of the shadow animatronics to go find Charlie. This would explain the thing that he saw that's referenced in FNAF 4, why he's afraid of the animatronics, and it's not like the shadow animatronics haven't led people to places before. They do it quite often. There's a lot more to it, and it is a really solid theory that's perfectly valid and reasonable. If you want to check it out yourself, the link is in the card and the description. And you totally should check it out, but you should wait until after you watch this video, because like continuous watch time is really important in the algorithm. And also, while I'm talking about the algorithm, you should like and subscribe because that also helps me in the algorithm. Thank you. And once again, I don't have any evidence that directly contradicts this theory. I'm not disproving it. But what I do have is some soft evidence and logical assumptions that I think better prove my own personal theory. As far as soft evidence and assumptions that go against this theory, the first is location. At this point, I personally think that Charlotte Emily was killed outside of a Freddy's location, not Fredbear's. And I personally believe that the restaurant that would be closest to the FNAF 4 house would be Fredbear's, which is now Junior's. So part of going into that is the books. Now, the Silver Eyes trilogy obviously is not in the same continuity as the games, but they're still canon, and they give us parallels to the games that can help us better explain things. One of those parallels, I think, is location. In the books, Charlie and whatever that guy's name is have to drive for a long time to go from Freddy's to Fredbear's, and when they get there, it's in a rural location and it's already closed down. Now, what do we see in Midnight Motorist? If later that night is referring to later in the night that William kills Charlotte Emily, the Midnight Motorist gameplay could be interpreted as William driving away from the Freddy's location for a while and then getting to a rural location with Junior's. This, I think, backs up the idea that Freddy's and Fredbear's are very far apart from each other. And then that, plus the fuse map we see in Sister Location, implies that the FNAF 4 house and Fredbear's are very close to each other. If this is all true, which is, granted, speculative, I think that this would go against the idea that the crying child would be running off to Freddy's and, by proxy, Charlotte that night, mainly just because of logistics. If it took William this long of driving to get there, how's the crying child getting there repeatedly on foot? The other assumption, I think, is that Junior's is in fact a bar, but it's a bar that was opened up within the old closed down Fredbear's location. I totally get that you can argue that Junior's is a representation of the FNAF 2 location, but I still think being a bar is a stronger argument. It has a bouncer, which places like bars and clubs typically do, who's just standing outside the entire time. And while there aren't many, if any, bars named Junior's specifically, an incredibly common trope is having a bar just be the name of the owner '(S), essentially in the possessive tense. An example, Duke's, O'Malley's, Moe's even. The reason the bar in The Simpsons is called Moe's is because it is an incredibly common trope to have a bar just be the name of the owner '(S). One that I think Junior's is leaning on. But why would a bar be here? I don't think it's just to establish that William was drunk that night. I think it's trying to establish that Fredbear's has been closed down since, adding information for the timeline and location and reason for William's anger. If you line up the FNAF 4 cutscene map and the Midnight Motorist map, it's pretty close, and you could make that argument. But even more so, if the sister location fuse map is to be believed, we know that the FNAF 4 house and Fredbear's are nearby. So all of this is suggesting that this Junior's was once the Fredbear's location. Essentially, soon after the bite that killed the crying child, Fredbear's closes down and somebody buys up that building and just turns it into a bar. This would not only tell us that the crying child dies first, shifting the place of Midnight Motorist in the timeline, but it would also give us extra reasons for why William hated Henry. Not only did Henry's creations, the animatronics, kill his son, they killed his dream. His restaurant that he's worked so hard for is now just some shitty dive bar. That's what's driving him into his rage. Alright, so what do I think happens in Midnight Motorist? Well, I think it's thematic as well, just like how both of the endings serve the same purpose. They both tell us different ends of the timeline. I think the minigames also serve a similar purpose to each other. They show us turning points of William in the narrative. Security Puppet is when William turns into a murderer. Fruity Maze is when William turns into a serial killer, otherwise known as the man behind the slaughter. But Midnight Motorist, right in between them, shows us when William finally fully loses his sanity and empathy and turns on his own family. The death of the crying childs hit the Aftons hard, none more than William Afton. He was once just an eccentric family man who loved these characters, but now he's spiraled into a drunken stupor. He would drink at a bar that was once his own restaurant, losing his mind, until eventually he found his own sick way to cope via blame. He had to deflect that this wasn't an accident, nor was it his fault for not being around enough. No, it's easier to process if somebody specifically is to blame. The man who created those animatronics, Henry Emily. It's Henry's fault that his son is dead. And it's Henry's fault that his dream restaurant is now just another bar. And one drunken, fateful night, he drove to Freddy's to give Henry a piece of his mind. Meanwhile, ever since the accident, Henry had fully focused on Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, the offshoot from Fredbear's, trying to distance itself from Fredbear's entirely. He even installed the security puppet to protect kids so something like this could never happen again. His mistake, though, was protecting children from accidents. He never imagined malice would be involved. The one night his only daughter is locked outside by some bullies and the security puppet is held up is the same night that William gets there. When he sees Charlotte all alone in that alleyway, he realizes he has an opportunity to settle the score. He can make Henry hurt the same way he does. And in a drunken fit of rage, he kills Charlotte Emily and drives off. Speeding back home, he tries to go back to the bar to wash his sins down with another drink, but he's turned away. After all, legally, bars have to turn away visibly overdrunk patrons. It's unsafe to let them drink anymore. He goes home, still angry, and he tries to take it out on his eldest son. His wife tells him, hey, he's had a rough day, lay off him, but he doesn't listen. And he tries to get inside his room, but the door's locked. Furious and delirious, he goes back into the rain, around the back, and tries to go in through the window, but he finds that his eldest son has broken through that locked window, running off to that place again. He'd be sorry when he got back. This was the last straw, as William's own sick revenge, and a way to prevent Michael from ever running away again. He'd put his eldest son in his nightmare experiment chambers. Pause. What is the nightmare chamber, and where did Michael go? It's been speculated ever since Sister Location that William Afton was actually conducting experiments that were very similar to FNAF 4. After all, in Sister Location, we see the cameras of what looks like the locations of FNAF 4, and although the house we see in FNAF 4 doesn't match the house that we see in the cutscenes of FNAF 4 or in Midnight Motorist, they do match the fuse map we see in Sister Location and the monitors here, implying that this might even be a separate location. And the last Tales from the Pizzaplex book that came out actually supports this theory. In Didophobia, we see Rory going through experiments in a chamber that is identical to FNAF 4. Even the toys on the ground are the same, but we learn that this is actually testing chambers filled with hallucinogenic gas that he's been trapped in for like 10 years. Now, to be clear, I still think the gameplay of FNAF 4 is the nightmares of Michael Afton after these experiments. There's just too many things that line up for it to be Michael's nightmares to be dismissed, but I think they're the recurring nightmares as a result of the trauma from going through this testing. I also think this is why Michael is so willing and obedient to William in the run-up to Sister Location. If you've been put into these testing chambers and then your jailer is like, hey, do this thing, Casey. Oh, recording with Casey is going to be an issue. Hopefully I'm still in the same location. If you couldn't tell, I'm still in this basement. We're going to be here for a while. And Casey jumped up on the desk and knocked over my camera. So hopefully I'm in the same location. I don't know. But if my jailer said, hey, I'm going to let you out of here, but you need to do something for me, I'd say, yes, sir, please, thank you. And I'd also be worried about doing it wrong under threat of being sent back into that nightmare chamber. So if that's what the nightmare chamber is, and that's the punishment for Michael, where was Michael go? Casey. And before y'all are like, oh, he just wants to be held. No, no, no. I love this cat. He is a menace. He does not want to be held. He wants to be fed again, even though I fed him an hour ago. But if that's what the Nightmare Chamber is, not you too, I just want to record a video. This is gonna be a rough couple months, y'all. But if that is what the Nightmare Chamber is and the punishment for Michael, where was he going in the first place? I do think that this mound is the grave of the crying child. Now, I've heard the counter argument that it couldn't be, because if the crying child's death is this public, there's no way that they would have gotten away with burying him in an unmarked grave in the middle of the woods. It would need to be done in like a legal and traditional manner. But consider the bite didn't kill the crying child. The text at the end of FNAF 4 and the medical equipment we see in the gameplay seem to imply that he was put into a coma and then later died. And if William was truly trying to put the crying child back together, it would make sense that he would have argued for his son to be in a coma at his own house. And once he was there, well, he could do experiments on him, try to bring him back in any way, and when it eventually fails and he dies, then to save face, he buries him in the woods with no one else knowing. I'm not saying it's guaranteed that this is the crying child, but I'm saying it's possible. And if it is, then Michael's guilt would have him returning to that nearby grave very often. But if that's the place that Michael's running off to, what are these animatronic footprints here? I think the movie actually gives us information on what that could be. Again, I don't think the movie is in continuity with the games, but like the books, there are parallels that we can lean on, and it's still FNAF canon. So theoretically, what the animatronics can do in the movie, they can do in the games. Specifically, Golden Freddy physically manifesting at the house of someone the spirit knows. We see Golden Freddy appear at Abby's house, and we know he's physically manifesting because when he gets in the taxi, it leans and lurches by his weight. So it's not just a hallucination, and this could say that the Golden Freddy we see in FNAF 1 and 2 also isn't a hallucination, but literally Golden Freddy physically manifesting in that location. But this whole scene really screams Midnight Motorist. A kid runs away while their guardian is watching TV, led away by an animatronic. I don't think that's on accident. I don't think this exactly is what's happening in Midnight Motorist and the couch person is actually the Aunt Jane. But what I'm saying is, this scene to me is telling us that it's possible the thing that leads Michael out of the house is Golden Freddy. Michael seems to have been sneaking out a lot and finally was locked in his room entirely. But for whatever reason, the crying child wanted him to run away again. And to get him out there, the crying child physically manifests Golden Freddy right outside his window. And that was enough for Michael to break out one final time. And that's what I think Midnight Motorist is trying to tell us. Like I said, there are multiple perfectly valid and understandable explanations for this weird cryptic minigame. And it's perfectly reasonable for anyone to think any of these other theories. This is just what I think. But if you're curious what other lore the movie might be telling us, you can go ahead and check out my video right here covering everything else I thought. Once again, this YouTube is available for only one more week. You have one more week to get this guy. He's so soft, I love him. But in the meantime, a huge shout out to the best channel members around, and until next time, as always, stay toasty, slices.